Well, welcome to the webinar today. You know, people are going back and forth between this a kind of Pollyanna, nothing is going on versus we're all going to die or hysteria. And there is a third path between denial and panic, and it's prudent creativity. And one of the keys to navigating this third path is understanding who the players in this drama are and what their motives are. We won't be focusing on politics or conspiracy theories in this webinar. We'll be talking about common sense. And the focus of this webinar is on navigating the third path in the area of healthcare. We have two guests who will illuminate post-pandemic new norm expectations in healthcare, Dr. Herb Cousins and Josh Feldstein. I'll introduce them in a moment, but before we do that, Paul Freeman is here to kick off this Elevate webinar and future Elevate webinars with a brief 5-minute update on the latest information about PPP loans. For those who don't yet know that abbreviation, PPP is an SBA loan that helps businesses keep their workforce employed during the current COVID-19 crisis. Paul Freeman is a 20-year veteran in the M&A space who works with lenders, intermediaries, and investors across the country to create opportunities through strategic alliances. Paul leverages his transactional expertise with the unique business restructuring process that Second Wind Consultants provides. Second Wind is the nation's leading business consultancy specializing in UCC Article 9 transactions to extract business value from distressed situations and preserve that value in new debt-free enterprises. This is probably more important right now than it's been in a long time. So take it away, Paul, with your quick 5-minute update on the current status of the PPP loans.
Thank you, Dr. Gruder. I appreciate it. There has been some recent developments in the PPP today. The PPP this morning officially ran out of money. So the PPP is currently closed, but later this afternoon, Congress is voting again to expand another $250 billion to continue the PPP program. No word, we all know what that means. A vote may or may not take place, may or may not pass. But the PPP started off really slowly. The first 10 days, they only funded 37% of the total fund availability. And just in the last 4 days, they have funded the other 63% of that money, mostly due to the big banks finally submitting their applications and the opening up of the guidance for the sole proprietors, the K-1 earners, the guaranteed distribution, and independent contractors. The same form will be used. I'm telling everybody to get the form completed. Talk to your banker, make sure that you're in line, make sure it's properly completed. You don't want to have an improper form in this time right now because it's going to go quickly. Estimates are right now the $250 billion will probably be gone in the next 7 days based on the current need at the larger banks and the regional banks that they have in queue right now.
Awesome. Thank you. Anything else that you want people to know before we move into the heart of this webinar?
Stay positive. We'll get through this like we do with everything else.
Well said, and yes, we shall. So thank you so much, Paul, for that update. And now it's my joy to introduce our featured guests for this webinar on what the post-pandemic new norm that is now beginning to emerge in healthcare is looking like. And so I'd like to introduce each of these esteemed experts one at a time, and then we'll actually get into our discussion. Dr. Herb Cousins is a national leader in elevating value in medicine by improving quality and lowering cost. He does this by facilitating consensus among hospital administrators, surgeons, and operating room crew. Dr. Cousins earned his MD at LSU, Louisiana State University, in 1992, and is a board-certified OBGYN. After starting his career with a small practice in Washington State, he moved to Wisconsin 6 years later, and in 2002, because he had an opportunity to open and develop his own practice, he then fueled innovation and high quality through that practice, which has now expanded to include 13 providers in 5 locations. An early adopter of robotic surgery in 2005, Dr. Cousins began using it as soon as it was approved for gynecology, and he has thus far completed approximately 1,000 cases while also tracking cost effectiveness in his own hospital and proctoring nationally. He joined Kava Robotics in 2014 with the goal of improving patient access nationally to high quality, minimally invasive surgery. Now, having proctored over 250 surgeons, Dr. Cousins' mission is to facilitate significant positive impacts in the future practice of medicine as a consultant and teacher, because, as he puts it, the future of medicine is changing. Big data, artificial intelligence, telemedicine, and other technology enablers will make the future practice of medicine quite different. Now, turning to introducing Josh Feldstein. Josh Feldstein is an applied health economist with 30 years of experience and a specialization in surgical robotics and minimally invasive surgery. Mr. Feldstein is a published healthcare book author and journal author, and he serves as health economics editor for American Health and Drug Benefits, a peer-reviewed journal for real-world evidence in benefit design. He has also designed medical provider education and offline cost-effectiveness analytic modeling in the fields of surgery, nutrition, ophthalmology, oncology, and infectious disease. Josh Feldstein has presented at numerous healthcare conferences, leading hospital systems nationally, North Carolina State University, and the University of Pennsylvania School of Public Health. As president and CEO of Kava Robotics International, Mr. Feldstein works with hospitals across the United States as a strategic advisor and with medical, surgical, and pharmaceutical industries as a strategy, research, and data consultant. So first of all, Herb and Josh, I'm really grateful that you both agreed to be on the webinar today, because we've really got to have some very serious discussions about the impacts of the current crisis on restructuring the healthcare industry. And this is really important for healthcare administrators, healthcare professionals, and healthcare consumers. So thank you for joining us on this webinar, Herb and Josh.
Thank you, David.
Thanks, Dave.
So why don't we get started by having each of you say a little bit about what you see is emerging in the healthcare landscape, not only in this crisis, but what's emerging from this crisis that's really starting to give us clues about what the new norm in healthcare is going to be emerging into as this immediate acute phase of this crisis subsides. Who would like to start between the two of you?
You can go ahead, Josh.
Well, I think what we're all seeing right now is a preparation for, at least in surgery, David, the restart of elective cases. And I think this is a very good indicator in terms of what we might anticipate over the next 6 months or so as things start to get back on track to some degree. Specifically, because of the stoppage of elective cases, there has been already across the United States very significant cutbacks to both staff and payroll. And we're seeing a very, very negative impact relative to both providers' incomes and jobs at the hospital level because of the movement of resources from surgery to population health, specifically the response to the COVID pandemic. Now, what that's done has created a very, very significant degradation of revenue into the hospital system. And when you look at an institution as a whole, where you've got somewhere on the order on average of about an 8% margin, and in many cases a lot less than that, to keep these hospitals rolling along, and you realize that surgery elective surgery particularly, is the economic engine of most hospitals and IDNs, these are hospital systems. What you see is a very, very big problem. So the majority of the income now has been withheld because of the stoppage of elective surgery. You've seen a push of resource allocation away from the operating room towards the management of the pandemic, which is not producing a very significant amount of near-term revenue. And you've already seen a layoff of staff and cutbacks with regard to pay for providers. All of this is now really strangling the economic viability of the hospitals across the United States. Now, this is all going to begin to shift and kind of boomerang in the other direction as things get started. And at this point, I'll turn this over to Herb, and I'll let him provide some additional commentary and direction on where we're going. Herb?
Wonderful.
Yeah, thanks. You know, just to put some numbers around some of the things that Josh talked about, we have areas in the United States that prepared for this surge of COVID patients that never did get them. So hospitals, you know, in the central U.S. and the Midwest are sitting empty right now. They have wards prepared for COVID patients and 8 patients in the hospital. So where the large population centers like New York and New Orleans and Seattle and Indianapolis and, you know, big cities like this are overwhelmed with patients, the majority of middle America is not. And so these hospitals have not only shut down elective surgery, but they've tried to distance their staff and protect their staff by moving outpatient medicine to telemed if they were prepared for that. But many hospitals were not only not prepared for the critically ill patients, they were not prepared for a virtual care world. And so not only did surgery stop, but outpatient medicine has stopped also. So many hospitals are struggling. Within 1 month, their revenue was negative, and they've been forced to, you know, we assume that because of this healthcare crisis that there's a shortage of healthcare workers, but there's really not. There's many sitting at home unemployed right now. So the healthcare system as a whole was sort of built on a house of cards of elective surgery, and ill prepared to not only take care of a critically ill pandemic, but also to manage the ongoing needs of primary care.
This is really powerful, especially for the public, for consumers, because, you know, a lot of people are thinking that hospitals are busier than ever right now. And so it's going to come, I think, as a surprise to a lot of people who aren't in the healthcare profession, that hospitals and the healthcare field in general is really just about as paralyzed in this crisis as the rest of the economy is. You know, this is really massive, and what both of you are really starting to refer to is the shifts that the healthcare field in general and hospitals and elective surgery procedures in general are going to need to be pivoting over into as we come out of the acute phase of dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I'd love to hear from each of you about where you see hospitals heading, where you see elective surgery heading as we pivot out of this. And maybe you can go ahead. And I saw, Josh, that you were about to say something. So,
Well, I'll start, and Herb and I think, can really tag team on this, David.
Sure.
The point, I believe, is that planning right now is absolutely critical at the highest level of hospitals and the IDNs, the systems across the United States. What we fear is that because of the crisis environment that we're now enduring, and because of the unknowns relative to the next 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks relative to the surge that we're now seeing spiking in different parts of the country at different times, the willingness to shift resources away from population health and COVID preparedness back toward the operating room, which is where the economic engine gets revved back up, there's going to be ambivalence, there's going to be fear, there's going to be confusion on the part of hospital administrators to be able to make that very difficult call. And if they make the wrong call and they don't restart the surgery and the revenue, and the patients don't show up, you have one set of problems. If they make a different set of decisions relative to restarting and then not having the resources, they've got a whole other problem. So we're in a damned if you do, damned if you don't environment. But somewhere in the middle, to get back to your original hypothesis in terms of how this needs to be governed, is going to, I think, direct where the thinking has to go. And if we can slowly start to get elective surgery moving again, and now there's talk about that in some very specific states and some areas of the country, and there can be a kind of a rolling restart as the necessity of primary care and COVID intervention begins to wane as we get on the back end of some of the curve in certain areas of the country. We will hopefully be able to start getting some money back into the system. Now, that is one piece of it. The other piece of it is going to be quality of care, and then the concern of being completely overrun relative to surgeons and crew and supply chain being able to support the boomerang effect of restarting. So this is a very complicated set of variables that hospital administrators have to start dealing with immediately.
Right, very good. And I want to, before you respond as well, Herb, I just want to put a bookmark there because I want you to be thinking about some tips that you might be able to offer about how that thinking can best evolve in hospitals. Herb, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think to tag off of what Josh said is slowly and ramp up. So we're not, let's talk just about the COVID situation. We may be on the backside of the curve as far as increasing cases on a daily basis, but we also don't have solid treatments nor prevention for COVID. So as social distancing starts to become either frustrating or get relaxed, we will continue to see COVID patients in the hospital. These present unique challenges in surgery because of we still have to intubate the patients. The patient has to be on a ventilator for a period of time. We don't have adequate testing to screen for these patients. So for instance, in one hospital that I'm aware of, they have 17 operating rooms available, most sitting idle. But knowing that urgent emergent cases currently and with the ramp up of elective cases coming up, they've dedicated 4 operating rooms to COVID patients as sort of dirty ORs, and then the other 13 rooms set aside for the elective cases. The other thing that's going to be critical, so that hospital was already challenged on space and capabilities with 17 rooms, and now they're going to be operating, an elective schedule with 13 rooms. So the requirement to methodically choose the cases, to methodically choose the surgeons, to methodically choose the patients and triage them to the right place at the right time has to have some kind of structure to it. The other thing that we're going to see is just like personal protective equipment has been difficult to obtain and depleted, we use all the same equipment in the operating room, masks and caps and gowns and gloves, and it's going to put a further strain on the supply chain. And one of the areas that people are not thinking about when we ramp up, or they're not at least talking about it as much, is anesthesia drugs. So with all of the ventilator patients across the United States, there become shortages of anesthesia drugs, and we're not going to have the capacity to go from 8 or 10 urgent emergent cases a day back to 80 cases a day in this one hospital. So we just don't have the capability of immediately flipping the switch. There has to be a well thought out, methodical approach and strategy to be conservative with our supplies and safe with the patients and operate on COVID patients safely, as well as non-COVID patients, and not make them sick.
Mhm. So before we shift gears to some other things I want to discuss with you, what kinds of tips do you each have for hospital administrators and key medical personnel for addressing some of these dimensions that they're really going to have to be facing pretty soon? What kinds of ideas do you have for them? Tips, hacks, suggestions?
Well, I would say for all institutions across the United States getting back into surgery more than ever, efficiency, 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 David. We've got to be incredibly mindful of limited supplies. We have to be mindful of limited human resources. And so we really would recommend that surgery programs think about putting their most efficient, most experienced surgeons on the front line. They've got to have their A team relative to crew. This is not a time to have B and C crews supporting surgeons. The overall clockwork relative to scheduling and all of the throughput perioperatively, preoperatively, perioperatively, and postoperatively has to be absolutely tremendous. This is going to save lives, it is going to save resources, and it is going to absolutely have an impact financially on the viability of these institutions. Now is not a time for sloppiness and confusion.
And I would add anesthesia. Most hospitals work under a model where they have a CRNA and an MD anesthesia in the room. That's duplicative and a waste of PPE. Anesthesia, your most skilled anesthesia teams need to do the intubations, whereas, maybe even unconscious sedation cases, CRNAs can do the work. We have put out some guidance on our website on things about topics like minimally invasive surgery. And as we're discovering, the COVID virus can live in the plume of smoke with cautery. It lives in the GI tract. So there are certain very high risk procedures like ENT procedures, oral surgery, dental procedures with drilling and aerosolization of potential virus, cautery on the bowel because the virus can live in the bowel. So, case type selection is important. We also know now that the comorbidities associated with poor outcomes in COVID patients, and the number one being COPD, is almost a 6x predictor of very bad outcomes with those patients. So if we can selectively do cases on non-smokers, younger patients, less COPD, less pre-existing disease like diabetes and hypertension, prioritizing patients based on their disease state. And this is hard to do because current EMRs aren't really designed to flag those at-risk factors, such as travel to New York City. So there are a lot of components and screening tools that the system is not really designed for currently to re-implement safe surgery.
Right. And just for our listeners who aren't necessarily familiar with all of the abbreviations, COPD is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And of course, that has to do with the lungs. So any kind of pre-existing weakness or condition in the lungs is going to put a person at a marked disadvantage in terms of their body's ability to effectively fight off COVID-19.
Right. This is essentially a new disease that we've only really had in the U.S. for about 6 weeks. It's a very difficult thing to give guidance on from a health perspective because there's not a ton of literature, peer-reviewed literature. But as this literature builds, You know, everyone knows that the spread rate is difficult to get a handle on. Why are there asymptomatic patients with the disease, and yet it kills other patients?
Exactly.
The severity of the disease is so host dependent, you know, on the patient. So if we're going to re-implement surgery on patients in the hospital, we need to be able to not only screen for the virus, but we need to screen for the patient who's going to be the most likely to suffer from the virus.
Precisely. And this is really a very important part of what I was hoping we would discuss during this conversation, because you know, in this acute emergency phase, the public health approach has essentially been a one-size-fits-all approach. And that makes sense in an acute emergency phase with a new disease that we really don't fully understand yet. That's not a sustainable approach. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how the entire medical approach with COVID-19 is going to need to pivot as we emerge out of the initial acute phase. Is one size fits all medicine the solution over the long term, or do we have to shift over to more customized approaches?
I'm going to give you a good Jewish answer here. So when you ask a question like that, I'm going to ask you another question. Have we ever seen an infectious disease in the history of mankind where we've isolated the well people?
Exactly. No, we have
And
not.
it's completely backwards in the sense of testing and identifying the sick people and isolating the sick people. So it's such a unique response to an infectious disease like we've never ever seen before.
That's really important for our listeners to understand. And I want to get into the implications of that. And Josh, I really want you to weigh in also as an applied healthcare economist, because health, there are market pressures that are attempting to influence this issue of one size fits all medicine versus customized medicine.
Well, I think, David, we all have been hearing the ongoing drumbeat of vaccination, and there's certainly a very wide range of medical insight and political insight around all of this. What we are hearing literally is changing almost on an hour-to-hour basis. The amazing effect of social media and the rapidity of communication on a global basis now is changing things in a way that has never ever affected the national and international narrative the way it is now. We're literally in a new world of communication. We're in a new world of economics. We're in a new world of healthcare, completely new territory. So, you know, a week ago, the idea of a vaccination was being put forward by the NIH and Fauci, and you heard Gates, and everybody else is coming out and talking about it. Well, you know, that may or may not be viable. It also may or may not apply to the whole population. But as we have come literally over the last several days to understand all of the mutations that are already evolving out of this virus, we're starting to see that a vaccination is probably implausible in many practical respects because of its variability. So that may have a very, very dead-end perspective on vaccination, whereas even a week ago, vaccination was a viable conversation. So we don't know if vaccination is or is not viable at this point, but it now looks to be very problematic. That may change tomorrow, and it could be different by 6 o'clock this evening. So that's one of the things that's so absolutely unbelievable right now in terms of trying to sort out where are we going, because the speed of knowledge is happening at such an incredible rate that information and knowledge is changing literally every 3, 4, 6 hours. We know a whole lot than we did before. So we have to be very careful about jumping to any kind of conclusion.
Very important. Very, very important. I really want to make sure our listeners underline what you just said about the speed of the unfolding of information, and what seems true today may actually end up not being true over the long run as more and more information emerges that's factual and science-based. Herb, do you want to weigh in on this?
No, I would agree. I wish I could pull up a graphic that I saw on one of the data websites, but it took a rectangle and said this is, like 100% of the medical information on infectious diseases, and all time quotes in the media, and coronavirus represented about 80% of the block. It was like 2.3 billion mentions in the media, compared to little tiny blocks of Ebola and HIV and historically. So this has been the focus of the media, for so long, and it's why it can be so confusing, because of all of the so-called experts in the media that are commenting on it.
Yes, and so this kind of brings me to another question I wanted to ask the both of you, and it's in the context of how much information and maybe disinformation or questionable information is flying around in social media. Because as you rightly said, Josh, we've never seen this kind of crisis in the era of social media. And in this era, one of my sound bites for a long time is, what you think is fact is usually spin. And so what suggestions do each of you have for not only for healthcare professionals, but in some ways, even more importantly, for healthcare consumers, about how to separate spin from fact? What kinds of guidelines can you give people to become more effective consumers of information about what's emerging in the COVID situation and in healthcare in general, really?
Well, I think as a pragmatic approach to the question, the idea is to stay out of harm's way to the greatest extent possible until there is a consolidation of understanding and there is some clarity emerges from the fog of this pandemic. So what we know is social distancing and self quarantining is one way to get off the bullseye. And that's a very important thing to recognize. That's not to say that that is in any way a sustainable approach to the economy, to healthcare, because over the near term, we're going to have to start thinking from a personalized medicine perspective. What does each individual have as strengths and weaknesses relative to being able to re-engage with society and get back to what would be some proximity to a normal life, which we all know is now going to change. So first of all, personalized medicine now is going to step into the forefront in a way that it's never really been considered before. And I think between now and that point where there are going to be some very clear delineations made based on evidence and science and the sifting through of all this fog, in the meantime, play it safe and don't take assumptions and don't listen to things that are in the early formative stage of social media explosiveness, which may or may not be true. Again, a week ago, everybody was thinking that maybe a vaccination is viable. A week later, that may not be the case. So if you can have that much of an extreme shift on that kind of a topic in 7 days, all bets are off.
Yeah, I would add a little medical credence to what Josh said about vaccines. So this is a little kind of general overview, but vaccines aren't all one size fits all. Some vaccines are made from live virus. Some vaccines are made from components of virus. The carrier of the vaccine, the other fillers and devices that are used to administer the vaccine induce the immune response. So we have a situation now where, and then sometimes vaccines are paired with each other to even boost that immune response higher and higher. We have a situation right now where, you have things like the original vaccine was discovered in the measles, right? So once you had measles, you were immune forever from getting measles. So now it's easier to make a vaccine against a virus like that, to induce that same level of immunity. No one has ever been immune from a coronavirus for the rest of their life. You get a common cold, and you may get another coronavirus cold the next year or even the same year. So coronavirus is not one of those viruses historically that has conferred lifelong immunity. So how can we make an artificial coronavirus that will confer lifelong immunity? It's not an easy task. Some vaccines take decades to manufacture and deliver, and so to think that we're going to be out of the woods with this in a year or two because a vaccine shows up is very, very wishful thinking. Similarly, not everyone needs to take every vaccine. So there are people who are not at risk of certain illnesses, and so overwhelming their system with a vaccine and inducing an artificial immune response may not be in their best interest. There are numerous examples of vaccine trials gone awry to try and push health on people, where in third world countries particularly, dangerous vaccine experiments have been promulgated on the human race. So I think that we need to, as you said, use an abundance of caution, and anyone who's standing on the street corner on social media saying that they have the answer, you have to think with a critical eye and question it, because right now we just don't have those answers.
So Josh, did you want to add something first?
I just wanted to say that I think we're going to see, David, an explosion of immune system enhancing, strengthening dialogue. I would also say that there are some things that are going to be more evidence-based that people should be educated on. We've not heard our elected officials speaking about this yet. It will probably take over social media over the next weeks and months as people start thinking about how can they improve their own immune function and their own natural protective capabilities, which is a very viable thing to be talking about. But again, caution. This is not a one-size-fits-all deal, and not every solution is a solution, nor is it safe, nor is it proven. So there are going to be probably a lot of people talking about this, but let's keep our feet on the ground and keep a clear head about this too.
Excellent. So I want to summarize a couple of things before we move forward, because the things you're saying, both of you are saying right now, are very, very important, and I think they need to be underscored. The first is don't assume that what you're hearing today in the media, in social media, from scientists who are investigating all of this, don't assume that what you hear today is final copy. It is a rough draft. It's a hypothesis. It's a possibility, and it's only going to be over time and research that we're going to end up discovering what's actually durably true. So treat everything you're hearing today as a possibility or as a hypothesis or as a lead, not as or as a rough draft, if you will, not as final copy. So that's one thing that I really want to underscore in what you're all saying. Another is that yes, of course, it's really important that as we move out of the acute emergency phase with COVID-19, the focus in terms of public awareness and in terms of healthcare needs to be on identifying how people can upgrade their immune system function so that they're more resilient against not just COVID-19 symptoms, but more resilient against illness all across the boards. And that, number one, you're pointing out rightly that there are a lot of myths about what upgrades immune function, a lot of assertions that are unsubstantiated so far. Some of those assertions may turn out to be spot on, and some of them might turn out to be kind of sort of right, and some of them will turn out to be spurious, really quite wrong. And on top of that, again, there isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all solution for immune system upgrades. There are people who have certain kinds of illnesses that cause their immune system to overfunction, and what's going to be an immune system upgrade for them is going to be quite different from a more average person whose immune system is not overfunctioning to begin with. So be wary of one-size-fits-all solutions, even in terms of how to upgrade your immune system function and effectiveness. I think that those things really need to be underscored. And then the whole issue of vaccines, you're both pointing out that vaccines as a general category of medical intervention very much have their place in healthcare and deserve a valued place in healthcare. And at the same time, not all vaccines are for all people. And this in turn leads to something that I'd like to have the two of you weigh in on, having to do with healthcare economy, which is, I'd love to have you illuminate for our listeners what the economic pressures are on in the pharmaceutical industry in terms of bringing new medications, new pharmaceuticals to market versus bringing immunizations to market, and how that's influencing the dialogue about immunization and how many people ought to get immunized and things like that. So can you kind of unpack the economy of all of that?
Why don't you go ahead, Josh, and do that, and then I'll give a very specific example of a vaccine in the market right now and the economy of it.
Sure. Well, when we think about the beginning of the pharma industry, David, one of the things that we see, if you go back to the 1870s, 1860s, that kind of range, companies like Merck or other companies today that are just landmark pharma companies, many of them started off as pharmacy firms, local shops that opened up, and they were just chemists. And a lot of the products that they sold were things like morphine or cocaine. And there was no regulation. There was no FDA. In fact, there was no licensure of doctors or physicians. The FDA didn't exist. So we're talking about an era where anything goes. Everything has been very, very heavily regulated, obviously, over the many decades. And what we look at today in the pharmaceutical industry is really an outgrowth of that very, in many ways, ignoble beginning, right? So what we look at now is a massive industry, which is obviously driven hugely by profits and Wall Street. And when you have an environment where even when the pharmaceutical industry is making profits, and they're making many pharma companies making big profits, there's always the question of how do we make more profits? The greed factor is always a part of the equation in business. And that is not to say that these organizations are uniquely driven by anything other than the profit motive. Many of these institutions are driven by people with very good, very, very moral motivations relative to human healthcare and the advancement of science. But there's also the very real influence of dollars and euros and money making. And so we have to be mindful of the fact that any solution has to be looked at from the perspective of the science of what does it actually accomplish relative to making people better, and where is the financial motivation behind it to drive this. And that is a huge component of the discussion. And so many people, when they looked at the vaccination solution initially, were screaming, profiteering, profiteering. Now, if the vaccine isn't as viable, perhaps they're going to shift back the other way to medications and what that's going to look like. So we need to be very mindful of the fact that there is a very huge financial driver behind any decision making. And now if we start unraveling all of that, we get closer and closer to the scene of the fire.
Thank you. Go ahead, Herb.
Yeah. So when we look at coronavirus, particularly when you think about it, let's say that a vaccine, any drug manufacturer weighs the development cost of a new drug against the market for that new drug, and how widely used it would be, and what kind of return on their investment are they going to get. And finding novel treatments for hypertension or diabetes or these other health conditions that are such major chronic health problems becomes a sort of a law of diminishing returns. So developing unique, better drugs for the treatment of those problems leads to lower and lower returns, whereas a vaccine, which is widely administered to very, very large groups of healthy people and not sick people, becomes a much greater return on investment. An example of that is the HPV vaccine. So here you have a condition of cervical cancer, which has decreased over time because of other good methods such as pap smears. And yet a vaccine was created that was recommended initially for the prevention of cervical cancer. Well, when initially that vaccine protected against 2 types of HPV virus, it's now a 9-valent vaccine, but it originally only protected women against 2 types. And there are about 60 types of HPV, and 12 in particular that are high risk. And so this only covered roughly disease causing about 50% of the precancers. It never was proven to lower the rate of cervical cancer. And yet it was recommended for every girl between 9 and 27 years old. Later, it was recommended for every boy between 9 and 27 years old, yet they don't have a cervix. So there had to be an indication created for the boys to actually take the vaccine, and that was anal cancer. So it was used to say that it prevented anal cancer. And now they've extended the population range with the 9-valent vaccine, because maybe if you were 21 years old and got the 2-valent vaccine, but now you're 30 years old, maybe you should take the 9-valent vaccine too. So they've extended the age in women up to 45 years old. So now you have a vaccine that's recommended for every woman between 9 and 45 years old, and every man or every boy between 9 and 27. Think of the economic impact of that vaccine for Merck. It's tremendous. Yet, you know what? You still have to get a pap smear. And the incidence of cervical cancer in the United States killing people is only 3,500 patients per year. So when I went back to the original conversation, which was, take the vaccine if you're at risk. So there are other ways to mitigate the risks of cervical cancer too, and that's monogamy. So if you don't catch the virus, you don't get the disease. So there's good screening, there's good prevention, yet we have a vaccine that's basically recommended for about half the population of the planet.
Right.
The
Well,
economics don't always make sense.
right. And this is a very big issue. There are other things I want us to touch on. So I know we could go down this as a very deep rabbit hole. Maybe we'll do that some other time. The kind of punctuation that I want to put on what both of you are saying is that from an economic point of view, and this is true, what I'm about to say is true not simply in healthcare or in the pharmaceutical industry or the immunization industry, it's true in general in business. There is socially responsible profitability and there's sociopathic profitability. And when there are market pressures and when there is economic pressure, the risk always is that socially responsible businesses can veer off mission and vision into sociopathic capitalism, sociopathic versions or perversions of capitalism, and we have to guard against that. There's no question about that, and there's no question about how easy it is for a business to get off track with those things in general. And then, of course, you're giving examples of how that can sometimes be a pressure in the pharmaceutical or immunization industries.
I would add one other point, and that is when we think about the future of what's going to be post pandemic, when you think about the rush for the flag relative to one or more of these pharma medication-based solutions, if vaccination proves to be not viable, David. What we also have to be aware of is that increasingly there is litigious thinking relative to the way pharma companies go about their business, which is they'll go after it, and if there is some litigation that happens 5-10 years down the road, if there are injuries, deaths, etc., they'll settle it in court and they'll write one big check, which will be a very small percentage of the overall revenue that they generated over the 5, 10, 20 years prior to that, and they're willing to take that risk, and it's the cost of doing business. This is not obviously something that people are going to come out publicly and talk about. But if you look at the behaviors of large pharma companies, you do see this type of strategic thinking. So once again, this says to the consumer, be careful. What appears to be a fantastic solution over the near term may or may not be. And we have to really bring that abundance of caution and science and evidence to the decisions that we make over the near term. We're going to be vulnerable. People are going to be very vulnerable because you have ignorance on the one hand, in terms of the science of what's really going on, and an enormous amount of fear and anxiety on the other. And if you start mixing ignorance and anxiety, you end up with solutions that may or may not be sound solutions.
Spot on, spot on. Ignorance plus anxiety leads to faulty decision making, and that is true psychologically across the boards with any kind of decision making. And when we're dealing with issues around life and death, that's even more in play in terms of the seriousness of the potential consequences. So I'm really glad that you're pointing that out. Before I pivot again in our remaining time to a couple of other hopefully high-level answers to some questions I want to ask you, is there anything else that you want to add about this piece, Herb?
No, I think that's covered it, and we did touch on the immune system, and I had mentioned before the lung risks, hypertension, diabetes, pre-existing cardiovascular diseases. Those are the things that we know right now. Eating healthy, don't smoke, lose weight, reduce your risks for these other problems, because currently they're bigger killers than corona, and if you get corona, they're more likely going to cause you to have severe disease. Those are just very simple steps that individuals can take to help protect themselves.
Yeah, it's so important because at least what we seem to be seeing so far is that the majority, in fact, it seems as though, and you correct me if this has been modified very recently, but it seems as though the majority of people who develop very severe and life-threatening reactions to coronavirus are people who have pre-existing underlying health conditions in the first place. Is that still understood to be accurate, or is that picture shifting?
And no, that's accurate. And there was actually 2 meta-analyses published this week, one from China and one from Europe, that looked at those exact factors. And the highest one we mentioned was emphysema or COPD, and that is a 6x multiplier, meaning that you're 6 times more likely to wind up in the ICU and on a ventilator if you have that as a pre-existing condition. And the top 5 were laid out. Hypertension is about 2.5, diabetes is about 2.5, pre-existing cerebrovascular disease is about 3, pre-existing heart disease is about 2.8, and smokers have more ACE2 receptors in their lungs than non-smokers. And that's the binding site of the virus in the lungs. And so smokers are more at risk for increased viral loads, which leads to more severe disease. Those are the big ones.
Yes, absolutely. It's very, very important for our listeners our viewers to understand that. I'd like to shift to a couple of bullet questions that each of them is a rabbit hole in and of itself, and I know that at the front end. But if you can just give a brief, high-level answer to these questions, I don't want to leave them as elephants in the room. So one question is that there's one approach that's being explored to dealing with COVID-19 in specific, and it's an antibody treatment instead of a vaccination. If either of you is familiar with that line of exploration, do you think that it's got some merit, or is that going to become a dead end as well?
I think that has some merit. Immunity is so far not been, we don't have enough time to see if it's going to be long term. And so administering the serum of convalescent patients who that serum already has an antibody in it may help patients fight off the illness quicker. There are a couple of companies working on that now. Some of the larger worldwide plasma labs have been contracted by the U.S. military as well as the U.S. government to collect the plasma of COVID patients and process it for immune sera.
Awesome, great. And next question is, again, in the spirit of not leaving elephants in the room, does it matter in terms of healthcare strategy, whether this turns out to be a coronavirus, this novel coronavirus, COVID-19, the virus itself turns out to be a natural mutation or a bioweapon? Does that matter in terms of healthcare strategy?
Well, I think it does. I think it does profoundly. Because if it turns out to be a naturally occurring virus, David, I think that the strategic thinking is going to be more aligned historically with what we've done and thought about in the past. I think that the strategies, the resources, the solutions, the training, it may be more of, it may be redeploying resources on the chessboard a little bit different. But I think there'll be some degree of comfort historically that we know what the tools are that we have. We may need some new ones, but that it's going to be relatively clear. Now, if you go down the other path, all bets are off. Now we're entering the world of the unknown, and I would say that would put a burden on our economy, on our healthcare providers, on our researchers, on our government officials, on our military. That would be unprecedented.
Yes, thank you. And last elephant in the room is about whether or not, or if you have any information about this, whether or not the microwave frequencies that 5G is transmitted through are going to turn out to have a harmful effect on the immune system in at least some people, or on overall health in some people. Might it be wise, or can you even weigh in on this about whether it might be wise to transfer 5G transmissions to a different frequency that's not a microwave frequency in terms of health impacts?
I'll start and go to our early conversation, and I'll say that I'm reserving my judgment. So, there's a lot of pro and con, and there's been some removal of that information from the internet. I don't think we know. Similarly, there are things that we don't know about all of the wireless communications and cell phones and, disease causing capability of bombarding ourselves with wireless waves. No one's ever done those experiments in any large scale to show that they're safe. Similarly, the information that says that they're harmful or difficult to pinpoint. And at least the research that I've done so far, and Josh has seen some pieces of this, population density, social gathering has been the primary driver of the prevalence of the disease that I've seen, and not necessarily other mitigating type factors like 5G.
Perfect. Thank you. And I hope you both appreciate the why I ask these questions, because they're questions that are on people's minds. And so I didn't want us to have this kind of conversation without at least our tipping our hats to being aware that these are questions that are emerging in the mind of the public. So I want to move into making some closing remarks. And before I do that, are there any final comments that either of the two of you have about anything that we haven't covered, or that you want to underscore in what we have covered?
Well, I'd start by just adding, David, that as we think about getting back to surgery, that would really be a critical enhancement to the health care and economic engine of this country and many other countries around the world. Done smartly and wisely with the proper amount of planning and training, this is going to start to bring some money back into the system, and it's going to start to ease some of the tremendous strain. It has to be done smartly, and the planning needs to take place immediately. We need to put our A teams on the front line, and they have got to work according to a high degree of efficiency to be able to get things on the right track. If we fumble this, we're going to see Chapter 11 filings in hospitals across the United States. We are going to see some unbelievable fumbles with regard to healthcare delivery. And the sequelae from what we're facing right now is just going to snowball. So we're in a very precarious situation. We've got one chance to get this right on the restart. We've got to do it correctly.
And I would add we didn't touch on outpatient medicine and primary care, but there's a whole new world that's going to develop with telemed. And if we cut the cost of the delivery of healthcare by building less bricks and mortar with less clinics and locations and things like that, and we meet the patients where they are at work and at home on telemed, we can accomplish a tremendous amount of cost savings in our healthcare system across the board.
Excellent. Yes. And I'm really glad that you included that in our comments. So in trying to summarize some of the territory that we've covered today as we move toward wrap up, I'm going to start by finally remembering to do what I should have remembered to do at the very beginning, which is I didn't even introduce myself. So just very briefly, I'm Dr. David Gruder. I'm a clinical and organizational development psychologist, and my role with Elevate and Blue Sky is as a psychological business strategist and a merger and acquisition success psychologist. So that's how I came to be the one that's interviewing the two of you on this Elevate webinar. And what I want to offer by way of final kind of summary comments is, first of all, we really are still in a rapidly unfolding discovery phase with COVID-19 and with all of its impacts and implications in terms of healthcare and healthcare economics. And don't believe pronouncements at this point, because everything is up in the air, as it must be when we're this early in exploring and discovering what's really going on and what really needs to be done about this particular illness. Second is a piggyback on that, which again, to reinforce exactly what you were saying about this, Josh. Ignorance plus fear equals faulty opinions and poor decisions. And that's why it's really important for us to remain very teachable, very curious, and very discerning in terms of what we conclude must be so. We're still too early in this process to really be able to make definitive conclusions about what's so. And the third piece is the kind of upward gaze in all of this, which is the hidden gifts that are coming out of and need to come out of what we're going through right now in terms of healthcare. And those hidden gifts are about the call to higher efficiency and effectiveness with primary care and telemedicine, higher efficiency with restorative health procedures like surgeries, elective or necessary surgeries for restoring health, and the rise of preventive and optimal health attention, really focusing far more than we ever have before on preventing illness and living in a state of optimal health throughout the lifespan. And in order to do that, to shift our focus from one-size-fits-all medicine to personalized medicine. Those to me are the massive takeaways or gifts that should come, that need to come from this current crisis in order to give the suffering that so many are experiencing and the deaths that so many people are being traumatized by, to give those things meaning. We have to derive these gifts from this undesired current crisis. Those are my final thoughts. Do either of you have anything to add on top of those?
Well said.
Good summary.
Well, thank you. And thank you again, both of you, Herb and Josh, for being on this Elevate webinar. Your insights are incredibly valuable, and I hope we get to do some follow-up webinars to do updates on the healthcare situation as we start to understand more definitively further down the road what's really going on with all of this in terms of treatment, in terms of prevention, and in terms of healthcare economics and patient care.
Thank you, David.
Thanks.
Thanks for being with us today. And I hope all of you who are watching this will be sure to tune in to the next Elevate webinar in our ongoing Elevate webinar series. And there's information for you about our upcoming webinars on the webinars section of the Blue Sky Elevate website.